Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. My name is David Cohn. I'd like to welcome everyone to the 4th annual Natalie Cohn Memorial Lecture. Each year, the Free Library sends the Spring Author Series to my dad, my brothers, and I, and we are tasked with selecting one for Mom's event. Some years, the list contains one of Mom's favorite authors. E.L. Doctorow, for example, was a no-brainer. Some years we select an author because the subject matter of the book seems particularly appropriate, as when we selected Dr. Louis Sullivan, author of Breaking Ground, My Life in Medicine. Admittedly, that choice was a bit of a nod to my dad. I keep waiting for someone to write a biography of Jimmy Rollins, and then this year, however, we hit the daily double. Not only one of my mother's favorite writers in Richard Ford, but a book title, between them, Remembering My Parents, that truly captures the spirit of this event. How better to honor Mom than to gather together as family and friends in a celebration of literature, language, and remembrance. It made for an easy and unanimous choice. The only thing missing from an event such as this is, of course, the one person who would appreciate it most. If she were here, Mom would savor every minute. It's now my pleasure to introduce Pulitzer Prize winner Richard Ford. Known for his candor, wit, and intelligence, he has been a literary force for more than 40 years. Winner of the 1995 Pulitzer Prize and PEN Faulkner Award for Independence Day, he has also been awarded Guggenheim and National Endowment for the Arts Fellowships. His 4 works following Everyman, Frank Bascombe, have delighted readers, and he has authored a number of other novels and story collections. He's now the Emanuel Roman and Barry Sardoff Professor of the Humanities and Professor of Writing at the Columbia University School of the Arts. Between them, Remembering My Parents, his first memoir, is an intimate portrait of his parents' travails across the panorama of mid-20th century America. Publishers Weekly hails every page of this little remembrance teems with Ford's luxuriant prose. His talk tonight will be in conversation with Andy Kahan, the Ruth and A. Morris Williams Jr. Director of Author Events. We're so pleased to have him here with us this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Richard Ford to the Free Library.
It's such an honor to get to be here and to remember your mother and your family. It's been a pleasure for me to have dinner with your family and being a mama's boy, as I am. I know what it is to miss your parents and miss your mother. I think I wrote this book at age 70-something because, quite to my surprise, I looked around and realized that I missed my parents. You think that longing is going to subside when you get old, and what is true is that it does not, and it's useful I hope that this book would be useful in a way to let people know it's all right. It's all right. That things that the received wisdom of life tells you is not true, is the proper province of literature to tell you that what you feel is what you feel. It's also nice to launch a book in the city of brotherly love. It's very hopeful. And it's very nice to be in the library. You know, I was a kid in the library in Jackson, Mississippi, what is now the Eudora Welty Library. And I was Eudora's literary executor for quite some time and knew her very, very well. But my mother, when I was a little boy, 8, would take me to the library and dump me there because it was air-conditioned and it was a safe place. And it was the precursor of what are now community centers in a way where kids can go and be safe and be around books and to understand that there is what books promises us, something else besides just whatever the daily life offers us. So thank you all for coming, and thank you all for supporting the library, and thank you for supporting the Natalie Cohn Memorial Lecture. I was going to read you the beginning of this book, and then Andy and I are going to sit down and go at each other, hammer and tongs. This book is called Between Them, and it's called Between Them because I'm an only child. It's odd for a 73-year-old man to think of himself as an only child, though my development is arrested at age 17, so it's not that strange. But I called it Between Them because, obviously, I came from some union of my parents. And when I was born and into the world, I immediately came between my parents, inevitably. And it was also the case that what remained true about my parents, who had been married 15 years before I was born, is that everything that stayed important to them throughout my father's life, his truncated life, the most important things that was true for them was between them. And what I was able to discover in writing this book was that I was always third, and that was great. Because I could look up to two people who loved each other, not more than they loved me, but they just loved each other in a way that only included them. So in that way, what was between them was the most important thing that they knew. And so I got to live in that environment. This is about my father, and it's called Gone, Remembering My Father. Somewhere deep in my childhood, my father was coming home off the road on a Friday night. He is a traveling salesman. It is 1951 or 52. He's carrying with him lumpy white butcher paper packages full of boiled shrimp or tamales or oysters by the pint he's brought up from Louisiana. The shrimp and tamales steam up hot and damp off the sleek papers when he opens them out. Lights in our small duplex on Congress Street in Jackson, Mississippi are switched on bright. My father, Parker Ford, is a large man, soft, heavy-seeming, smiling widely as if he knew a funny joke. He is excited to be home. He sniffs with pleasure. His blue eyes sparkle. My mother is standing beside him, relieved he's back. She is buoyant, happy. He spreads the packages out onto the metal kitchen tabletop for us to see before we eat. It is as festive as life can possibly be. My father is home again. My and my mother's week has anticipated this arrival. Edna, will you? Edna, did you? Son, 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 I'm in the middle of everything. Normal life between his Monday leavings and the Friday nights when he comes back. Normal life is the interstitial time, a time he doesn't need to know about and that my mother saves him from. If something bad has happened, if she and I have a row, always possible. If I have had trouble in school, also possible. This news will be covered over, manicured for his peace of mind. I don't remember my mother ever saying, I'll have to tell your father about this, or wait till your father comes home, or your father will not like that. He confers, they confer, the administration of the week's events, including my supervision, onto her. If he doesn't have to hear it when he's home, ebullient and smiling with packages, it can be assumed nothing so bad has gone on, which is true, and to that extent is fine with me. Thank you. I'm going to talk to him tonight.
Richard, thank you so much for that reading. I think, as you've just heard, it was memorable, and the phrases were engaging, and on a sentence-by-sentence level, it's typically Richard, typically exquisite prose.
Well, I want to write books you don't mind reading. I want to write books you don't have to study.
It worked this time, but it was worth studying. I underlined most of the book to the point where it became superfluous, so the whole thing is underlined. When you were last here, I asked you what you were working on, and you mentioned a memoir about your father. Had you originally intended to focus solely on him, or had you thought your parents would each have their own section?
I wrote the memoir about my mother in 1986, 5 years after she died. And when I wrote it, I thought, just kind of ipso facto, well, you're going to have to write one about your father someday. But because my father was a traveling salesman and died when I was 16, He hadn't been in my life at that point for a long time. And prior to that, when he was alive, because he was a traveling salesman, as that little passage that I read indicates, he wasn't there a lot even then. But he was my father, and he was the only father I had, and I loved him, and he loved me, and we had a wonderful, as it were, life. And I thought, well, I have to find a way to write about him, because I had written rewardingly about my mother, and I thought I had to find a way to write rewardingly about my father. But I couldn't figure out how to do it because of those absences. So what I did was I didn't put a timetable on myself. I just started collecting notes, which is what I do. I keep a little notebook, and I have hundreds of these notebooks now in the freezer of my house. In my house.
That was going to be a follow-up question. Was your mother stuck in the freezer?
Yeah, but I just started making notes about everything that came to my mind about my father. And in a short 33 years, I had enough to sort of critical mass from which to write about my father.
The subtitle of the book is Remembering My Parents, and each section is differently framed. Your father's section, Gone, is subtitled Remembering My Father. Your mother's section is subtitled My Mother in Memory. And I wonder, how are these differences significant to the way that you tell their stories?
You know, Andy, when I was writing the essay about my father, I wrote it without any reference to the essay I wrote about my mother. I didn't want one to be a template for the other. And so I don't think they're different. And I was just trying to dream up a title for each which would distinguish one from the other. In my own workable sense of these two, they are alike. I tried to make them as much as I could stylistically alike, even though 30 years had passed. My sense of what kind of arc each had would be, in my view of it, different. But it's also true that having written these Frank Bascombe novels over the course of about 30-plus years, 35 years, I think they're all alike too, but they're not. And readers tell me all the time that they're not. And they say that these novels change stylistically, and they change in their sentence length, and they change in their way of choosing verbs. And so I guess in a way there's a part of it in which I'm not entirely confident about. I don't know. I mean, I like them both. I like both of these essays. They satisfy me. But how they stylistically distinguish themselves, I don't really know, or maybe I don't care.
Well, I cared a little, more than you did.
Maybe, books don't become themselves until they escape the control of the author. And when they escape the control of the author, namely when they're published and finished, then they become what they wholly are, which means that they become what they wholly are in your mind, separate from how they are in my mind, who was merely writing them.
Well, one thing I noticed in your section about your father was that a lot of the language is sort of very contingent, perforce because you didn't know him quite as well. So it's could have and might have and speculative and possible and
subjunctive, suppositional.
Yeah, and so that's not the case with your mother, where it's more, I got the sense you were more writing to create this experience with your father, where perhaps more with your mother it was in recollection. Yeah. And that's where you headed with that. At least that was my reading of it.
Can't be wrong. I mean, you read it.
I love that attitude.
And you learn, the truth is you do learn things about your book when you hand it over to a readership. Sure. People do say things to you which, I mean, when you write a book, you're just as limited as a human being is when you read a book. And so I tried to express and put into the book everything I knew. There would inevitably be certain limitations to that, which I'm comfortable with.
Just to flesh out your folks a bit and their families, would you give us a thumbnail sketch of each of their grandparents, or rather each of your grandparents?
Yeah, sure. My parents were Arkies. They were from West Arkansas, a place not known to most of the world. For perfectly arguable reasons. My mother's family were from very far northwest Arkansas, which is to say the northern part of the Ozarks, and they were from the sticks. and they were dirt poor. My mother was born in 1910 into a house that did not have a floor. And her mother was 14 years old when she was born, and they were of mixed blood, Osage, and maybe something else. I don't know what. And then my grandmother, divorced my mother's father because she was aspirational, didn't want to live in the sticks, and she married a younger man who was a club boxer. This was around 1914, 1915. Oklahoma wasn't a state then, and to the extent that it's a state now. And then they hit the road, my grandmother and her new husband, and he was aspirational also and handsome, and they got on with life and put my mother into the convent school of St. Anne's in Fort Smith. My father's family were Irish, and my grandmother was from County Cavan, and his father was Irish too, but had not come from recent immigrants. And they were fairly prosperous landowners and kind of real estate moguls until my grandfather basically lost whatever money he had and committed suicide in 1916 when my father was 10 by drinking carbolic acid, sitting on the front porch at night, and leaving his mother with 3 small children and no obvious source of income. So there was a reason in my parents' lives when they finally met prior to 1928 to hove together. I think that when my father saw my mother, he thought to himself, oh my God, because my mother was very pretty. And my mother, who had had a kind of a rough and tumble life up until then, thought to herself, finally.
Something stable with this guy.
Something stable, some nice, sweet Irish boy to love.
What personality traits of your parents do you think best describe them for us?
Well, they were volatile, and I am volatile. We're all of us volatile. When your parentage is Irish and Osage Indian, volatility is going to be part of your upbringing. Whiskey was not always their friend, but they weren't alcoholics by any means, but they were loving. They loved as I said before, loved each other intensely, and they loved me when I came along intensely. And there was nobody else because they had made this little troika out of a family. There was just nobody else. We were a sodality as a family living in Jackson, Mississippi, where they didn't know anybody. They'd come there on the year that I was born because of my father's job, and we were close. We were really close. And all of you who have only children know what it's like to have an only child and be really close. There's a lot of friction. So we had a lot of friction, but it was always loving friction. My father was shy and courteous and slightly self-effacing, and my mother was not shy, not particularly courteous, and not particularly self-effacing. So I have both of their qualities. I have impeccable manners, which has a quality to end like that.
We're not going to test that this evening.
And I'm getting too old to test it.
So after they married, they lived on the road for quite a while. You mentioned that sort of period of 15 years.
Yes.
Where they traveled around. And did they have any special stories that they like to tell, or is there any story in particular that you recall fondly about their time on the road?
A challenge to writing a memoir, let me tell you. They didn't tell me anything. They were of a stratum of society that did not tell people things. They held inside themselves what was going on. And it just made me wonder if, in fact, and I don't mean it in a subversive way, but it just made me wonder if just living through the Depression as they did, it wasn't always so comfortable for them. I mean, and also when you have a father who's a suicide, and when you have parents like my mother had, who were raffish, rough trade kind of people, maybe they just didn't reside much in the past. And I know through those 15 years that they were living on the road and living within a little apartment in Little Rock, but mostly in the car, traveling my father's traveling territory, they lived in the present is what they did. They didn't anticipate the future, and they were kind of running a little bit away from whatever had been their past. So when I was growing up, and I wrote a lecture about this a few years ago, they didn't tell me anything. They really didn't tell me anything about what were all the, for instance, they never told me that my grandfather was a suicide. I mean, these Irish people, they don't tell you stuff like that. And there were all kinds of other sort of slightly murky things floating around that they didn't tell me about. And what it did for me as a consequence was to make me an eavesdropper. It made me an embroiderer of what I did know. It made me a little bit of a sneak because I was always trying to listen to what people were saying. Because I was, they were older, they were full adults. I was interested in what life they were living, and they wouldn't tell me about it, so I had to figure it out. Not bad training for a novelist, actually, when you get right down to it. Yeah.
You said they settled in Jackson. What is your earliest memory of that time? Your father's off the road. They moved to Jackson in order to accommodate the Middle Territory at the suggestion of his boss.
My earliest memory is having scarlet fever when I was 3 years old. Yeah. And then after that, I have just one of those sensibilities in which the things I remember are often traumatic things. I remember my father having a heart attack in 1948 in the middle of the night, and the ambulance coming to the house and him being taken out when I was 4 on a stretcher. And then the next morning going to the hospital and confronting him under an oxygen tent. And I remember a big snowstorm, oddly, in Mississippi, right? A big snowstorm in 1949. I have a great memory. But for then, even then, as a sub 5-year-old, I don't remember as much as I'd like to.
Looking back, do you get the sense that your mother perhaps missed that time on the road once you
I'm sure she did.
Settled in
I'm
Jackson?
sure she did. I mean, there's no way at age 35 that you can have a child and have had a life which was fully inclusive up to then that you wouldn't miss it when it changed. And that is a thing that, as a child, I completely appreciated, even though I didn't know much about it then. And as a memoirist about my parents, I completely appreciate also. I'm sympathetic with how that must have happened, although they wanted to have a child very much. I actually think my parents didn't know what caused children. But both of them, for all that I've said about them being volatile and loving, they weren't knowledgeable people. They didn't look at subjects and think around the sides of subjects. They pretty much confronted life head on and lived in the realities and the practicalities of things. And they were not particularly aspirational, as my grandparents were. So sure, I know she missed it. I know she missed it because being stuck at home with a baby and just the two of us while my father was out on the road had to have been an abrupt change in life.
Well, speaking of the road, you used the phrases normal life and interstitial time in that beginning piece that you read to describe your father's absence from the family. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about how, when he returned, the effect that had on your and your mother's dynamic.
Well, let's see. Well, my mother and I were frictive, which isn't to say we didn't love each other and weren't nice to each other. But I'm an oppositional person, and I was an oppositional little boy, and she was volatile, and so we were pretty much going at it all week long. I didn't do well in school. I failed the first grade. I almost failed the second grade. The hopes for my future were not elaborate. And but then when my father got home, then everything had to be pacified, because her view was that he shouldn't be plagued by what had been going on in the prior week, and he liked that too. I think he would have been he was a good father, and he would have been an even better father if he had been there. But because of her way of sort of organizing life, when he came home, everything had to be great. And she just said, she never said, I'm going to tell your father what you did. She would just say, your father's going to be home on Friday. We'll talk about this later, whatever it was. And so I understood that his intimate life with her was more important. Their private life was more important. His time at home during the weekends was more important than pretty much anything. And I think that for a child, it's not a bad thing to feel that your parents' lives are paramount and yours are subordinate. I know it's not usual in modern-day child-rearing sciences for children to think that, but whenever I hear my friends say, well, we wanted to go on vacation in August, but Julie says she has something to do with her friends, so we can't go, I think to myself, what's wrong with you? Hello? Nobody ever asked me if I wanted to do this or if I wanted to do that. They were going to do this, and so that's what we did. That's how it ought to be. But then I don't have children, and so how would I know now how it is?
Despite the frictive aspects you mentioned, would you say you were close as a family?
Oh, Christ, yes. We were too close in a way. I mean, we were just in each other's business night and day. I mean, yes, we were very close as a family.
Despite his being on the road?
Yeah. I mean, kids begin to think most everything that's not completely bizarre is normal. And I thought that even though I knew my friends' fathers weren't, or I thought my friends' fathers were normal, of course they weren't, but I thought that even though my father was gone all week, and didn't come to parent-teacher meetings, and didn't always come to my baseball games, and didn't take me to the doctor or to the dentist, I just thought that's what normal was. Because in a way, and this I know will speak to things that it was his job to do that, and because it was his job to do that, that's the way life was. We were, in that way, a working-class family. And if your job said you did this, then you did that. And more to the point, he loved his job. So it was not even an issue. I mean, I never thought, for instance, all of those years when he was going out on the road every week, that, gee, wouldn't it be nice if my father worked in a hardware store? Or wouldn't it be nice if my father had a profession or was around the house more? I just thought, this is the way it is, and that's what you live with and deal with. And I didn't think there was anything wrong with it. And here I am. I'm 73 years old. I can talk about how much I love them, so how can I be wrong?
You had mentioned your father's first heart attack and how that truncated his life.
Yes.
How did it change his relationship with you and what he seemed to want out of life?
Well, I think he became scared after he had a heart attack, and he had a heart murmur, which was a mitral valve dysfunction, which if he had lived 5 more years probably could have been fixed. But I knew that after he had this heart attack that he was convalescing, and then at that point I was shipped up to live with my grandparents in Little Rock as much as was humanly possible. And so then I started a whole other sort of second life with my grandparents, who ran an enormous hotel in Little Rock, which, as you can imagine, was quite wonderful. So that I always realized that my father's infirmity and his illness offered me all kinds of unexpected opportunities, so I had a very mixed view of that. But then also, my mother started driving for him, and when I couldn't be farmed away with my grandparents, I went with them. So then we were driving all over South Louisiana, and we were driving in the summers, because I was out of school, we were driving all over Alabama and western Georgia. So we did all of that together. And ultimately, my father got well enough, and these are all things that happened in the summers, that I could go along with him on his trips, and my mother could stay home and rest up. And what I found was, to my great surprise, was that when I was alone with my father, we got along impeccably. We never argued. We never had any misunderstandings. He seemed to appreciate and to like and to understand me, and I appreciated and liked and understood him. And it was as if my mother had become a kind of an allergic presence in life in those times.
About how old were you?
Well, I was 9, 10, 11, 12. Riding around in South Louisiana with my father in his company car, just the two of us. And it was vivid, needless to say, vivid.
There's so much to talk about and so much ground to cover, but let me skip ahead a bit to your father's second heart attack and
His last heart
attack. And it's a harrowing part of the book to read. What I want to do is jump past that. You made an incredibly valiant effort to save him, but I want to focus on the aftermath. And you had briefly touched on this, but how did his death directly affect your relationship with your mother and change your lives together?
Well, I had been in trouble with the police a lot, and for stealing and fighting and breaking into houses and stealing cars and things like that. And my mother, when my father died, shortly after, took me aside and said, "Richard," she said, "I cannot come and get you out of jail." She said, "Your father's gone. I have to get a job. You can't do that anymore." And just as if it was entirely in my control and of my volition, I quit doing it. And what I understood was that there was now a candor between my mother and me, which there had never precisely been, and that our life together was going to be closer, and that my father's absence was permanent. Could not be wished. He could not be wished back into existence, and I didn't think of myself as an adult. I didn't think that my childhood was over at age 16, but something had profoundly changed between my mother and me, and between my mother and the world outside of our little less, diminished family. And so I got my shit together. Is basically what I did. I just decided I cannot be calling up my mother from jail. And so it seemed reasonable. Because when I remember the one time we went to juvenile court together, we were sitting in the judge's chambers, and the judge said, "Mrs. Ford, I'm going to send Richard to a juvenile home." And my mother just went to pieces, right in front of the judge and right in front of me. And I think it kind of broke his heart in a way. And so he didn't send me to the juvenile home in Mississippi. And in a way, he saved my life by not sending me there, and saved our family by not sending me there. And I realized when I saw my mother just in tears, because now she'd lost her husband, now she's about to lose her son. It's just too much. And I just thought to myself, pay attention. This is your life talking to you.
It also thematically seems to emphasize something that you talk about in the book is, with your father's section, it's sort of this absence, which is a presence, and vice versa.
Yeah.
And
true.
in your mother's section, there's this aloneness together, you call it.
Yes. Yeah. Well, that's what we were. We both thought we were alone. She was certainly alone in her grief. There was nothing about having a son that could allay her grief, because they were so close. And because her grief isolated her, I became slightly emotionally isolated from her as well. And not in a way that anyone would have noticed. I just thought I was on my own. Not without a mother, not without love. But I just thought, well, your life, this is one of the odd things about growing up. One of the things that probably everybody experiences growing up, but novelists, certainly people who become novelists, certainly experience, is that there's a difference in the way I feel from the way I am told I'm supposed to feel. And I was very, very aware that I didn't feel the way I was supposed to feel, the way that the culture told me I was supposed to feel. And it doesn't mean that this makes me special. I'm the least unspecial man in the world. But I knew that. I knew that I didn't grieve enough for my father when he died, because when he died, the world kind of cracked open a little bit for me, and that separated me from my mother to a certain extent. In other words, there was this feeling that there was something about my father's death that I just wasn't sorry enough about, and that stuck with me a long time, until I realized that how you feel is how you feel. And that's how I felt. The saddest thing about my father's death was that he had to die, was that his life had to stop. It was not the consequences of his death upon his son.
I used the word relationship a little earlier on when talking about you and your mother, and there's a section in the book where you say, does one ever have a relationship with one's mother?
Yeah.
I think not. Why not?
Well, because relationship is a cliche. Relationship is a received concept. What I had with my mother was life. And so to say that we had a relationship would have meant that it would have been submissive to some sociological template, or would have been, submissive to some way that mothers and children are supposed to feel or have felt historically. We didn't do that. We loved each other, and we held together in all kinds of ways that only really a piece of literature could itemize.
And that's what you do in this book.
Yeah.
Do you think you would have become a writer if your father hadn't died when you were 16?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Why not?
Well, because he didn't do books. My mother did, but only as a sort of a divertissement. And I think at a certain point, because we were getting closer when he died, I think he would have just taken me in hand. He would have just said, because I had no ambitions of any kind whatsoever. I was just a little punk. And he would have just taken a hand in my life and said, son, what you need to do is get a job. And I have a job that I can find for you. It would have been either that, or I would have gone in the military, which I did do. I joined the Marine Corps when I was 20. And I had a yen for the military. I mean, I was an unruly and unrulable child. And in a way, the idea of a uniform in the military was very attractive to me. I thought that if I joined the Marines or if I went to a military school, something like that, I would get organized. I knew the whole time when I was growing up that I was an unruly and unrulable child. I didn't like it. So I thought a good dose of the military would have done me good, and it did. But I think it would have happened a lot sooner if my father had been alive, or else I would have just gotten a job and gone on selling starch like he did. And the truth is, if I had done that, if I had gone in the military earlier than I did, or if I had had a life selling laundry starch, that would have been just fine, frankly. All these books that I would not have written wouldn't be on anybody's record. It wouldn't make any difference at all. That if I had gone on and done what my father would have wanted me to do, I would have been happy. I don't like that notion of life's destiny being sort of coercive in a way. I went to law school, and I sometimes think that if I had gone on and practiced law, that would have been just fine too. And I went in the Marine Corps, and if I had my way, I would have stayed in the Marine Corps, and that would have been fine too. I just don't have this sense that because I wrote these books all these years, for 40 years, that's the greatest thing in the world. No, it's just what happened. It's just what happened.
Took a little free will and elbow grease to do it, though.
Well, of course, but it would have taken elbow grease to be a lifer in the Marine Corps. It would have been taken elbow grease, God knows, to be an attorney. It would have all been a life. And I think, frankly, it's because I see the world that way, sort of on a horizontal plane rather than a hierarchical plane, that I can appreciate other lives more.
Well, you're telling us these bits of your life that actually aren't in the book, and I wonder, you focused on your parents. Are you going to switch gears and work more toward autobiography in your next
Absolutely
book?
Absolutely not. No, because, Andy, I haven't tried to live an interesting life, and I've succeeded. I've just tried to write really great books. And in order to really write great books, if Cyril Connolly said the only true function of a writer is to write a masterpiece. That's what I've tried to do every time I've sat down, to write a masterpiece. And in order to do that, you're living your life. Those days are your days, but they are all subordinated to being both a husband, which is my highest goal, and to be a novelist, which is my second highest goal. So it doesn't necessarily make for, hunting elephants in Africa.
It's been done. Speaking of writing, during a previous visit, you said something to the effect that when you sat down to write, you were aware that the words at any given point could be written different than they are written. And I wonder, does that same phenomenon apply to nonfiction? And if so, how does that affect the truth of the story you're telling us?
Well, there is definitely a phenomenon that every young writer and every old writer has to reckon with, which is that at the end of every day, if you had written one more paragraph, but you don't, you stop, you wait till the next day, that the next paragraph that you write the next morning would be different from the paragraph that you had written if you had gone ahead and written it the night before, the afternoon before. So that is always the case. And that is always the case in writing memoir. Even though you are faithful to the facts, and memoirs are about facts, it is still the case that when you end one day's writing and start the next day, you're the same person, but you wouldn't write the same sentence or the same paragraph. So that's true. And it is also the case that when you when you choose, this is what writing is mostly choosing words, one after the next word, after the next word, after the next word. And you come to a word which the sentence is somehow made paramount. And you think to yourself, ooh, here's a chance for a great word. I'm going to put a great word here. If you're writing a novel, the great word that you choose doesn't have to be faithful to anything, but the sentence being a great sentence. But when you're writing a memoir, the great word that you choose has to be true. It has to be faithful to the person that you think you're writing about. Someplace at the end of this book, I say, and this is opposite to this very subject, my parents were not made of words. My parents' lives were made of deeds and lives, and quite actual. So that when I choose a word that has to, in some ways, refract their lives or reflect their lives, it has to be true. And so in that way, while things, it could be a different word, but the word, whatever it is, must be right. It can't just be anything to amplify your parents' lives. It has to be true about them. And you have to say to yourself when you write it, is that true?
So before we go to the audience questions, one last question. Writing that way in this book, any surprises that you hadn't anticipated?
Well, I think the biggest thing I realized is what we started out talking about, was that I was third, and that was great. I was, when you write a memoir of people who are as unexceptional as my parents were, they caused very little to happen except me and the love that they had for each other. You're looking for a virtue. You're looking for something that the notice that you give to your parents makes available to you, or that you invent. And what I realized was how much they loved each other, and how much that, even though I knew it at the time, how much the fact that they loved each other as much as they did was imbued in everything I realized about them and everything I remembered about them. And what that made me think is that I lived in the, so to speak, cradle of that love, and even though I was third, it was a wonderful life.
Thank you for telling us that.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'm curious about your relationship with Eudora Welty and how she might have influenced what you did.
Well, she only influenced what I did in a profound sense. That when you live in a little pissant town like Jackson, Mississippi, which is what it is, to have living basically in your neighborhood a world-class writer, a real world-class writer, Chekhovian in consequence. It let you know at a low level of impulse that it was possible to be a writer. That the problems that young writers have are mostly sort of circumstantial in nature. How am I going to persuade my parents that what I'm doing is worth doing? How am I going to keep from going to work at the bank? How am I going to elude all these practicalities at a young age? If you lived in Jackson, Mississippi, you knew that it was okay to be a writer. You knew that that seemingly other than usual vocation was embraceable. And Eudora, even though I didn't know her till 1986, she exemplified that and was a model for us. And the fact was also true that, and part and parcel of that was that everybody loved Eudora. Everybody who saw Eudora was her friend, and that was for me so attractive. To be a writer, this is one of my pet theories about writing. That what writers are largely are people who, for one reason or another, feel slightly that they don't fit in, and not in a romantic way or not in a pathological way, just in a sort of almost immaterial way, and that writing becomes the agency by which you gain entry into the culture, into whatever are the things that the culture offers that you can get now. I know it's been that way. For me, as an outsider kid in Mississippi, to be a writer and then to come back in my life, because you really can come back to those places, Mississippi, and to be accepted because of what I did as a writer has been one of the most satisfying things in my life. Not extolled or not revered, but just, there's Richard Ford. I knew him when he was 16 years old, and now he writes books. It's been interesting and wonderful in a way. And I think Eudora was the template for that.
Might lead into my question, which is, if you have this fairly horizontal view of writing is not better than or the only way to have a happy life,
Yes.
when the writing is not going well, and there are other options that could make you just as happy, what is it that keeps you going?
Well, that's a good question. My wife is one thing. The first thing before we got married, not the first thing we ever agreed about, surely, but just before we got married, she asked me, reasonably enough, she said, "What are you going to do when we get married?" Because I had been out of the Marine Corps and I'd been out of law school. And I said, I think I'm going to try to be a writer. She said, "Oh, great." She said, "That's wonderful." She said, "I'll get a job and work and you stay home and write." And that was a safety net that has accompanied me for 50 years now. But more to your point was that after I had written 2 books, neither one of them nobody had read them. They got published and they went out into the world and all the copies came back. And I thought to myself after 2 books that I had had my shot at being a writer. And so I just set the whole thing aside and went off and did what I thought I could best do, which was to be a sports writer, and got a job as a sports writer and worked at my job as a sports writer really happily. I thought it was so much easier than being a novelist. And I met all my heroes, and the writing wasn't hard, and it paid really well, and I flew first class every place I was going. It was so cool, and then the magazine went out of existence, and right out from under me. And so I went back to Princeton, and I said to Christina, I said, "I don't know what in the hell to do. I don't have any skills." I thought, I guess I could try to write a novel again. So I sort of, to use my own word and that you used, horizontally sort of came back to the thought of writing a novel. But I thought to myself, if I'm going to do it, write a novel another time, I really better do it a lot better than I had been doing it, because how it was working out for me wasn't working out. So that's sort of what it is. In other words, I just never thought if I fell out of the vocation of being a novelist that I never thought the world would end. My wife would still love me, and I still wouldn't have any children. So it was fine, I don't like to hear writers talk about that sort of fatedness of it. It ain't fated. You choose it.
It's not really a question, it's a comment. I just wanted to say that in so many of the biographies we read now are so traumatic and terrible, stressful, dysfunctional families. And it's such a pleasure to hear you talk about your parents who loved each other,
Yeah.
and you were in the appropriate spot in that relationship. And it's really lovely, actually.
I kind of, when I was writing this book, I kept thinking to myself, are there suppressed memories that you don't know about?
Right.
Are there things that happen that are just,
All the terrible negative
can't
stuff
be
you probably
spoken?
forgot. Yeah.
I don't think so, and the reason I don't think so was because it was all so volatile.
Yeah.
If my mother told me, Richard, go out and collect for your paper route, and I would say, no, I don't want to go, she'd just throw my bag of money at me. And, I'd duck sometimes and come whistling across the room. So it was it was not always specific in our household,
Having now set down a memoir of your mother and your father and their relationship, is it the case when you look back that key elements of either their personality or the relationship found their way into your fiction?
Into my fiction. Well, I have been aware over the course of my writing life that certain aspects of my mother found their way into my stories. I know that for a fact. I mean, I can be specific about it. Just for one instance, after my father died, and actually only about a year and a half after my father died, my mother began to have a relationship with a man who was married. And I don't really know what the nature of their relationship was, but I know it made her really happy because he had an airplane, and he was a kind of a rugged, handsome man, and he had nice cars, and he was nice to me. And I know that I have written stories, wildlife particularly, about a family in which the father goes away and the mother immediately falls into a relationship, not an illicit relationship, just a relationship with another man. So I think those kinds of vivid life memories almost inevitably filter into your work in some way. My wife tells me that the father that I wrote about in Canada is her father. Not my father, but her father. And indeed, her father made a really big impression on me when we were, because I had to go down to where he lived in Atlanta and ask for her hand in marriage. It was that long ago. And so all of those things, all of those little, but in snippets and bits and pieces, find themselves in work of mine in a way. There is a way in which, and it's not always true of fiction, but it can be sometimes true, that what you write, what seems interesting to you to write about, acts as a kind of compensation for experiences that you didn't have. Now, again, it's not always true of fiction. There's a little snippet of a poem by Octavio Paz, and the snippet goes, between what I see and what I say, between what I say and what I dream, between what I dream and what I keep silent is poetry. And what he means by that is that the urge to write a poem or the urge to write a novel writes into an available space. It's a virtual space which the writer imagines. It's between what I see and what I say. And for me, that available space was often that there was experiences that I didn't have, that I relished but didn't have because of various occurrences in life, which happens to us all, and I could write into that space a little bit.
I'm wondering what your parents might have thought of this book had they had the opportunity to read it. And are there points of contention or discomfort that they would find? And how did you handle that when you thought there might have been?
I didn't worry about it. They're dead. I was just worried about telling the truth about them. but they were lovely people, and so there was no tales out of school to tell. I mean, I remember the couple of fights they had, which were really wonderful fights and vivid to me because I observed them, but they were kind of pitiful fights in a way, and they always ended with all three of us in bed together and somebody crying, never me. I think my mother would have disputed things. She would have disputed a lot of my suppositions about her. Even though she might have thought they were true, she would have still disputed them because she was disputatious. My father wouldn't have read it at all. He wouldn't have known what in the hell to make of it, and would have just thought to himself, I've never imagined anything like this. Why would you do that? So that's what it was. But I mean, that's so far removed from possible. My father, the thought that my father would have read a book that I would have written, no, it's not imaginable. My mother did live to see me publish 2 books, but I think she mostly thought about me was that I didn't have a job. She didn't really understand that at all. So that when I finally got a job teaching at Princeton, it's a wonderful moment. She was up, we were living in Princeton, and she came up to visit, and she walked into where I was writing, and she said, I have to tell you something. She said, I was 37 years old. She said, I'm so glad you finally gotten started. I said, well, Mother, I'm 37 and I've written 2 novels. I said, well, yes. She said, I know about that. She said, but to have a job teaching at Princeton, she said, it's just so wonderful. So I immediately quit my job at Princeton. I lasted at Princeton 1 year. I just didn't want her to think that whatever it was that made her so happy, that made me so unhappy, I was going to keep on doing to keep her happy. I told you we were just disputatious with each other.
I want to read a short passage before we exit the auditorium. If you had known my parents, I'm comfortable you and I could come to different assessments of them. But my hope is that by writing this, they would simply be recognizable as the 2 people I say they were. That is quite an act of love. Thank you, Richard Ford.